Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
But we return now to a story which we used to talk about all the time on the programme, for slightly embarrassing and indeed personal reasons. The prominence and proliferation of buy-to-let landlording was something that I accidentally fell into myself, and then I think it's probably the only truly what's the word you'd use? Sacrificing position I've ever taken politically. I'm not one of those people who believes that anyone should be prevented from spending their money on whatever they want to spend their money on. I don't, for example, have much of a problem. Obviously, if you listen to this programme on a regular basis, I have no problem whatsoever with something like private education or even to a degree private health, because I think you can pay money to get the best available service while simultaneously believing and working towards a society in which money doesn't make a difference to the sort of health provision or education that you can get. But when it came to buy-to-let properties, I wouldn't say I regret it now, but now my kids are getting older and the property market seems to have bottomed out or plateaued for now. I do look back and think, gosh, it is such a lovely bit of business to get somebody else to buy you a house. If you can raise enough, if you can get a mortgage, and you didn't even need that much capital to get a mortgage, did you, 20 years ago, 10 years ago? Or just over 10 years ago, just before 2008. And it always seemed to me that the buy-to-let was just too good to be true on a broader scale. Absolutely fantastic for beg your pardon, for the landlords, but probably doing permanent damage to society on a broader scale. Why do you say that, James? Well, because how many young people have we spoken to on this programme over the years that are actually earning proper money, but given the ramifications and implications of the financial crisis, they can't get a deposit, they can't get on the ladder, but they're paying so much in rent that their ability to pay a mortgage is unquestionable. It's just that the lenders won't take a risk on them, because I suppose there's also the fear that if they had to repossess the property in the event of them not being able to keep up payments, it would be worth less than they'd lent them in the first place. I mean, negative equity is bad news for everybody involved. I think I understand this, although, again, as in the last hour, I'm certainly not chalking this up as one of the issues that I think I've got nailed to the floor. So we got rid of ours. We ended up with one by accident. I told you this story. It used to be, almost a weekly topic on the programme, didn't it, 10 years ago? We ended up by accident being buy-to-let landlords, because the house we really wanted to buy, we were going to lose, and we hadn't sold the house that we were in. So we just sort of realised we could just about juggle the cash, buy the house where we live now, and keep the house that we lived in at the time with the mortgage paid by putting tenants in there. And we tried to do the right thing by going for tenants from a housing association and all of that. But still, it was money that was paying our mortgage. That house was being bought for us by our tenants. And that at a time when lots and lots of people couldn't buy a house, so we sold it. And I still look back and think, crikey, am I going to really regret that when we retire? I really look back and think, what the hell were you thinking? Because it's a little pat on the back, self-righteous, virtue signalling, aren't you wonderful type self-congratulation is not going to pay for my retirement, is it? It's not going to keep me warm in bed at night. But anyway, enough about my personal psychodrama. On with the bigger issues. On with the bigger issues at hand. It is just brilliant if you can flick off the voices in your head like the ones I just described to get somebody to buy you a house. I don't think that I'm even exaggerating when I put it like that. And that's why it seemed to me at the time to be so egregious. And yet, of course, when you ask questions about banning it, you realise that you can't really ban landlords, because that would put the Queen out of business. Biggest landlords in the country, the Duke of Westminster and the Queen and the Duchy of Cornwall. So there's no way you're ever going to have laws that are designed to mean that everybody who's got a 1,000-year lease on a flat in Eaton Square doesn't have to give it back to the Duke of Westminster when it all ends, when it all comes to an end. So you were never going to get legislation introduced by a Conservative or a centre-left government, which is all I've ever lived under. You were never going to get legislation like that introduced. So what did they try to do? They tried to have a bit of a pop was it 2 budgets ago? Just before Osborne went out, so 3 budgets ago, at the landlords, addressing the tax situation of the buy-to-let landlord in the hope of just making it a less attractive prospect, a less attractive way for these investors to spend their money. So should they be curbed is the question. And oddly, it's a former advisor to George Osborne who says that now they could. Neil O'Brien, no relation, is the Tory MP for Harborough, and he says today in a report for a think tank, the UK is one of the cheapest countries for investors involved in residential rental investments. And his suggestion is that landlords of new rented properties should instead be treated as owner-occupiers and not be able to claim mortgage and interest relief. So the tax break was phased out for owner-occupiers in the 1980s and 90s. We need a bit of an explainer on that, if you understand the issue better than I do. Give me a quick heads up. But the tax break, I suppose, is born of the fact that you can portray it as a business, right? So you get a break on your mortgage if you're not covering it with the rent coming in. I think. I don't know. Someone can explain it to me. But I want to talk about the bigger issue. I want to talk about the simpler question of whether or not they are. And well, actually, I'll tell you what I want to work out. Have they played as big a part in the dispossession of the younger generation as I've always thought that they have? I could easily be wrong. I often am. So that's what I'd like to find out. And look, the demonisation of all landlords is as daft as the demonisation of all tenants. There's good people and bad people in every single walk of life. I always think of the caller who was talking to us about Universal Credit a couple of weeks ago and works for a company that lets out rooms to people in terrible places in terms of life, people who could never dream of getting on the ladder. But in terms of that very specific millennial malaise, the people earning proper money in the United Kingdom, particularly but no longer by any means exclusively in the southeast, far from it, in fact, these days. Huge parts of Manchester, these blocks are being bought up by Chinese investors who don't even need to put tenants in because the property went up in value so quickly that it was an inconvenience to them to even put human beings in the buildings. I just want you to tell me whether, and we do it from anecdotal perspective as well as evidential. So you are paying an amount of money in rent that a 46-year-old like me just won't believe. Because if you're paying that much in rent every month but you can't get a mortgage, 0345 6060 973. And the second question then becomes, is it as responsible for the current logjam in property ownership as I've always presumed it is? Because I'm far from being an expert on this issue, and my perspective is entirely and exclusively personal. 11:15 is the time. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Because when you hear of a housing shortage, it doesn't actually mean that people are homeless. This is one of the great myths of the issue. It means that people can't live where they want to live. A housing shortage can be a description of a society in which 50% of people currently renting would rather buy. There's a housing shortage. There's a shortage of housing that they can buy. And the reason why they can't buy it is because the buy-to-let landlords have bought it. And of course, once it's been put through the mangle of tabloidification, the housing shortage becomes yet another thing that you say is due to immigration or overpopulation or Schrodinger's immigrant or whatever it may be. In fact, if you are in your 20s or 30s and you want to buy a home and you can't, it's not because the homes don't exist. How do I know that? Because you currently live in it. You just can't buy it because lending restrictions have been so stringent since the financial crisis, and those with a bit of capital or a lot of capital get such an unfair head start when it comes to borrowing to buy that you are never ever going to catch up. That's my analysis. It always has been. It could be wrong. 0345 6060 973. And I need someone just probably to explain a little more intelligently what this proposal is from Neil O'Brien, the Tory MP for Harborough, and examine whether or not it would actually play a positive role in freeing up properties currently in the buy-to-let category for potential homeowners who are currently squeezed out of the market entirely. 11:17. And, needless to say, Incorrigible FCA has helped me come to a better understanding of the finances on this. So if you borrow a ton of money, you know you get taxed on what's left over when you've done all of your accounts, when you've done your expenditures, if you're running a small business or you're self-employed, when you do your tax return, you pay tax on what's left after you've done all of your expenses. So under the previous legislation, what you would have is tax relief of up to 45% on mortgage interest. So I take out a mortgage, okay, on a property for which I'm being paid rent, but I could get up to, depending on how much of that rent covered how much of that mortgage, I could get up to 45% tax relief on my mortgage interest. So that would count almost as that would count as an expense, which meant effectively that the government was subsidising the ability of investors to buy properties, not just because they had a bit of capital put to one side, but even on an interest-only mortgage. You'd be turning a profit on that bit of it alone, because all the money that you were paying in mortgage interest, you could knock 45% off it before you started paying tax on it. So it turns your money essentially into tax-free income. The money that you're using to pay the mortgage interest becomes tax-free income, potentially, up to a maximum of 45%. Crikey, I understand it. George Osborne's proposal is to set that maximum at 20%, which means, I presume, I've got it now, which means that Neil O'Brien's proposal today, in an article for a think tank set up by former advisors to Theresa May and George Osborne, the think tank's called Onward, suggests that all those tax breaks should go. Boom. Who could possibly disagree with that? Now, apart from people who are currently making a nice little nest egg out of getting that tax break, but given that a tax break involves money coming out of the pockets of everybody else and essentially going into the pockets of people who can afford to invest in property that other people live in, I don't think you need to be Wolfie Smith, I got a lovely message off Robert Lindsay on Twitter the other day. Regular listeners to this programme will know that Wolfie Smith, the leader of the Tooting Liberation Front from Citizen Smith, one of the best sitcoms of the 70s and early 80s. He's the patron saint of this programme in the early days. Then a lovely message off the star of that show on Twitter the other day, which had a lovely symmetry to it. I meant to tell you that sooner. So that's it, isn't it? But you can't really, unless you are benefiting from this tax break, you can't really justify it, can you, on a broader stage? Maybe you can. Let's find out. Joanna is in Dartford. Joanna, what would you like to say?
This is a really vast subject. I'm really quite nervous about it.
Don't be. It's only me.
Hello.
Hi.
So, I think there's lots of things that have influenced the housing market. One of the big things is the fact that we allow houses to be, or homes to be built and sold to overseas investors who want to put their money in a safe place.
Yes.
And are not living in them. So we're destroying communities because these places can be left empty and they can be vast areas.
See, that again is it's quite hard to understand that, isn't it? Because because most of us operate economically within the parameters of our own experience and our own financial status. So you just think, well, hang on a minute, even if I'm making 15 grand a year on that property going up in value, or 100 grand a year, I'd make even more if I put some tenants in there, but they don't see it like that.
Well, because then they've got to manage it, and really all they want to do is take money out of their home country and put it somewhere safe.
Right.
So
and we are one of the we're one of the international centres of that practice, if not the.
Absolutely.
Right. Go on.
So then you have a government that has previously encouraged small investors who are looking for ways to provide a pension.
Yes.
To invest in housing, because the government isn't investing in housing.
Say that again?
The government are encouraging small investors to invest in housing at one point because the government weren't investing in housing themselves.
Does that work?
So
hang on, because when you say invest in housing, it doesn't. I want them to build houses. I don't want them to buy them.
Exactly. I want the government to build houses. The government should be building social housing. What the government did is decide that the private landlords could provide social housing.
Right.
And that housing benefit would pay for it.
Yes. Okay. And I'd get the equity.
Housing.
I'd get the equity at the end of it.
Yep.
Which makes it worth my while on a huge scale, as you say, as preparation for my retirement. So it was an abnegation of responsibility by government. When did that come in? Do you know, that 45%?
I don't know when that was, but
I presume it was under previous governments.
Really?
It can't have started in 2010, can it?
We're talking of selling off of council housing, aren't we?
Yes, we are. Yes, and trying to replace the market.
Housing stock.
You're in the business, I presume.
I am in the business,
Okay.
so we manage property for people who are professional portfolio holders, so they won't necessarily have a lot of finance on it.
Right.
And we manage property for small investors who just want somewhere so that their kids can have somewhere when they grow up.
So you're about to tell me it's not the fault of your clients, it's all the fault of those nasty foreign investors.
No, I'm going to say that there are
Tell the truth. Tell the truth. Tell the truth.
And that small investors, because the guys with a lot of money and no finance aren't impacted, the small investors will be driven out of the market. And what I'm seeing now is that I've got huge numbers of people knocking on my door for properties to let, and I haven't got any properties for them.
Yes, but I can fix that. Because not only am I going to abolish tax breaks for your investors, for your clients, I'm also going to make it illegal to buy a property and leave it empty if you're a foreign investor.
Well, I totally agree with the second one.
But I can do both.
But they haven't done that.
No, but I am going to. I'm under my glorious rule. I might let you have a portfolio for
That's
how.
fine. You can do that bit. Just, don't demonise the
I'm
guys
not
out there saying,
demonising anybody.
I can't get money on the stock market.
Categorically
So I'm
said
going
we
to
weren't
put my money
demonising,
in
and you.
property locally.
I said don't demonise, and now you're ringing up to tell me that we're demonising. This is where, as one gets older, one realises that the footballification of everything is so unhelpful. Because of course I understand the motivations of your clients and your company, but you can't really argue that in some cases, tenants who, because the cost of living is so high and the cost of property is so exorbitant, tenants who could quite easily afford to pay the monthly payments on a mortgage but can't get a deposit together, they're buying the flat that they live in for your clients.
Well, my children are in that position.
Yes.
Because my children are having to rent at exorbitant rents.
Well, there you go. So you know of what
But
I speak.
I don't think it's the buy-to-let landlord.
Oh, of course it is, Joanna. Of course it is, because because unless... I know that there's a knock-on effect, and I know sometimes I embarrass myself when I try and wade into these issues, but I hope I'm getting better. Because your children are not in the market for a brand spanking new build with river views on the south side of the River Thames, are they? They just want a normal place in Dartford to live in, and that is not what is being snapped up by rapacious overseas investors looking to launder their money.
No, but what that's doing is driving up the cost of housing overall.
I know, that's why I said knock-on effect. You see, I'm so clever.
Yes.
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 So could we legislate to get what? Go on.
Who are pulling out of the market because the conditions are changing for them and are selling their small portfolios aren't selling them at reduced costs.
Yet.
So we're in a position where we're going to see people losing money in a market where already we're under pressure and business isn't producing.
Yeah, but they
income.
shouldn't be getting tax breaks, should they?
Well, you get tax breaks if you run a business. Now, the government is saying that they
But
want
if you run a
landlords
business,
to
you're
be
putting product
professional.
into the marketplace. I'm just saying that I think it would probably, in what you've
You're
described.
saying that housing shouldn't be a product.
Yes, it should be a home.
Well, I don't disagree with you.
It's not the same as selling
widgets.
widgets.
Not set up like that.
Well, it could be. That's what they're trying to do. I mean, we're clearly not going to agree because
a 20% tax break.
it should be zero. You shouldn't get a tax break, but you should be allowed to be a buy-to-let landlord. You just shouldn't
You should be allowed to offset your costs of running a business.
Yes.
If I'm a taxi driver and I have to hire my taxi,
Yes.
I can claim the loan back on my taxi
To me, this
hire.
is astonishing, an astonishing exchange that I shall remember for the rest of my days, because it's so categorically clear to me that, of course, a taxi driver should be able to offset his costs of driving a taxi against his tax. But a landlord shouldn't. A home should be different. I'm going to turn into a Naira in Bevan in a moment.
Then that's fine. Then the government should be providing the housing.
Yes, I agree with that as well.
Fine. But
Fine.
the government isn't providing the housing.
No, but the housing is there.
If they enough social housing, these people wouldn't need these homes.
It doesn't have to be
the
just.
prices would come down.
It doesn't just have to be social housing. It's all the housing. It's not the social housing I'm focusing on today. It's your own children. I'm speaking up for your children, and you're consigning them to a lifetime of renting.
Absolutely.
What sort of a monster are you?
And is there a reason my children shouldn't be entitled to social housing?
Well, that's an entirely different debate, and I suspect we're both on the same side of it. But I am not. Look, there's no way we can continue this conversation because
tweak of a market that is going to impact those at the lower end And the people who are making the money out of it, distorting the market...
The lower end of the buy-to-let landlord market.
...be able to do.
But, yeah, all right. Well, in conclusion, because obviously we're not going to end this phone call with you suddenly turning into a turkey that votes for Christmas. In conclusion, the lower end of the buy-to-let landlord market, on my list of people who need help from the government financially, they come in at the moment at 7 million an eighth.
OK.
Have a wonderful day.
But
No, 11:31. Where Joanna's wonderful efforts, administrations notwithstanding, it's increasingly difficult to see how we can justify tax breaks for buy-to-let landlords unless you see property. Well, look, I mean, why shouldn't Doris and Derek stick some of their savings in property in order to see it realise a return that they wouldn't get on the stock market, given that the biggest fortunes in the world are built, certainly the biggest fortunes in this country, are built on doing precisely that. I just remember the Duke of Westminster. I must have told you this a million times, but some lines are so good they merit repetition. I was asked to give advice. The last Duke of Westminster was asked to give advice. He was asked for some advice on, you know, how to build up such an immense fortune. And he goes, best advice I can give you is to have an ancestor who came over with William the Conqueror. So it's absolutely beautiful. So you own the land. You have to be Karl Marx to recognise that owning the land on which we live is the finest way of ensuring both the gap between the haves and the have-nots, quite literally, and the continuing enrichment of the haves to the detriment of the have-nots. Oh, did I mention the Tooting Popular Front? I think I did, didn't I? James is in Sidcup. James, what would you like to say?
Morning, James.
Hello, mate.
Nice to speak to you again.
Likewise.
We've done Grenfell and we did Sadiq on affordable housing.
OK. We're catching up with events at the Grenfell inquiry later this morning with Rachel Venables, so stick around for that.
Will do. Still haven't rehoused them as I suggested they wouldn't a year ago.
You did.
The reason I raise those is, of course, is because your affordable housing bone is connected to your buy-to-let landlord bone, etc., etc.
Yeah.
Housing is housing is housing. And what's happened is, increasingly, it's become marketised. You talked earlier about people getting very interested in large government contracts around Heathrow, etc., etc. The fact of the matter is, what has happened because it's on a house-by-house basis, you don't tend to think of it that way. But I've been in the game for nearly 40 years now, the housing and building.
I remember, yes.
Now, so what has increasingly happened through the increase in credit initially and the deregulation of the banks, we saw house prices start to rise. But as we got to the financial crisis, which was essentially a real estate crisis,
yes.
To prop it, we needed first to do extraordinary monetary creation, but also we needed to think of other ways to keep the bubbler going, and that was, of course, to make it interesting. And it's a man or woman-made issue, the buy-to-let issue. There's absolutely no doubt. You take a look at the charts and take a look at house prices and correlate it against buy-to-let, and when that was starting to, increase and create trouble, then we got into into help to buy.
Yes.
So another funding stream, this time through the government, or through the government guaranteeing banks to make loans. Now, if that sounds familiar, that's exactly what
led us into the financial crisis in 2008.
Absolutely.
God,
so, just on your previous caller, they're fantastic. I really enjoyed that. And conflicted isn't the word. God bless her. And let's think of those poor,
landlords,
newcomers to the buy-to-let scene with 4 or 5 properties.
Yeah.
Rather than these ones that haven't got any mortgage on their property at all.
You focus on them, the big players, rather than all the medium-sized and very little players, not even 4 or 5, 2 or 3, one. What needs one? So, in your view, and for listeners who aren't familiar with James's contributions to this programme over the years, he understands these issues, in my mind, completely. What do you think would happen if they just ended all tax breaks for buy-to-let landlords? How big a chunk would it take out of the tribe?
Well, we now have a 20% of the households in Britain now live in private sector properties. It's doubled. and we have virtually
doubled since it was. When did it come in, James? Do you know? When did the tax relief come in on buy? Why was there a sudden explosion in buy-to-let landlord?
It was over the last 10 years because they couldn't get people to buy homes. It's as simple as that. The house building was reducing. The government wasn't putting anything in for affordable housing, which is a cash flow to builders.
Yes.
So as that reduced, house building reduced until we got to record lows, as you'll recall. So this was another way of stimulating house building. And it was clothed in a policy that said private landlords are good things that we wish. And
then of course, loads of former social housing, former council housing got caught up in this net as well, didn't it? With big vested interests now owning the homes that were sold under Margaret Thatcher's legislation and subsequently by Labour governments. They piled in on the practice of right to buy, and that means now, arguably, we've sort of reverted to 19th century sensibilities where massive mill owners and master sweeps, latter-day mill owners, own entire streets of houses in which it used to be the people who paid the rent to live there would be paying the local authority or the government, and now they're paying an investment fund or a massive landlord.
Well, the logic of all of this, James, is that those people that Joanne was talking about, the smaller ones,
yes,
eventually will no longer be the landlords there. The larger landlords will consolidate, and there's been a huge burst of finance, but essentially it only works if you're big. Over time, we will see, as you said, entire streets bought up property by property. You will notice in your streets, as I do, that as homeowners move out, they're not selling, they're putting students in. They're, they're putting... it's a bit more rarefied than that around my way, but it will be... It's a lot of French bankers moving in around us, but they're probably going to move out again after Brexit, aren't they? So I have noticed this. I pointed it out to my wife the other day. One of the streets near us, 3 signs up. The problem with near me, James, just to digress slightly, is that the local estate agents sponsor all the primary school summer fairs. So sometimes you walk down a road and you think there's 40 houses for sale, and then you double check and they're all advertising the local summer fair at the primary school around the corner. So when I've actually sorted the wheat from the chaff, there were only 3 properties available to move into on the street, and they were all to let. And when we moved there 12 years ago, you never saw a to let sign round ours, ever. It was always for sale. Well, the fact of the matter is, even in your rarefied part of the world, we're talking about people can't manage it per house. They're doing it. I told you I was preparing a PhD.
You did.
Still in the sort of preparatory stages.
Yes.
And I suggested to you have a look at that Beebe series, The Secret History of Our Streets.
Yes.
You will be blown apart by Notting Hill and Kennington and other, just what happened after the war in terms of how ownership changed. These homes that were full of very poor people became the £1 million mansions.
That's right.
And take a look at the bankers who have done extremely well in the last 10 years. I'm not political, but through study, I'm increasingly seeing the milieu I worked in. It's sort of the lines are sort of de-blurring. I would just finish with this. My daughter went to college at Royal Holloway in Egham.
Yes.
Tara lives in Egham.
I can't put you in. So you're not looking for a date, are you, James?
No.
All right, carry on.
But I don't want to burst your bubble, James, but she did say she had a master's in real estate.
Yeah.
And if you just put that together with a 3rd runway...
no, come on! Don't rain on Tara's parade. It was her explanation that I found really interesting. She doesn't have a vested interest because of what she studied.
No.
Any more than you don't be like saying that because you're doing a PhD in something related to housing. Then you must be feathering your own nest with your academic inks. How is the PhD coming along? When are you going to finish it?
I told you it's years. So these things will.
I know.
It might be a master's before it's a.
All right. Well, I look forward to inviting Dr. James from Sidcup onto the programme.
Nice one.
Any time now. 11:45. The appeal by Uber against the lifting of their licence, the imminent lifting of their licence, being held at Westminster Magistrates Court today. We've sent Theo Ushwood over there in a black cab. I can't go in a black cab. It's the state of his expenses. He's gone on a Boris bike. A Ken bike. The result of that will come in today. Well, I don't think we'll get the result today, but we'll find out from Theo later what has been going on. Let me just take a moment to tell you some of the stuff surrounding this story that is particularly intriguing. Charlie and Nell, I will be with you imminently, but some of the numbers on the Uber stuff: 2,500 drivers probed by Uber for misconduct. So you'll remember that the licence was lifted not because it is essentially disruptive capitalism designed to ensure that wealthy investors can get their hands on one of the few areas of life where ordinary people could still make a decent living. That's my reason for thinking that Uber is a scar upon the skin of this city and indeed this country. But that obviously isn't something that's covered by TfL's remit. They instead threatened to withdraw the licence and still intend to, unless this appeal works, on the grounds that Uber wasn't properly investigating allegations of misbehaviour and criminal activity, including sex assault, stalking and dangerous driving. So what they're going to do in court is try to prove that now they are investigating their own drivers for alleged misconduct, and that means that we know that they are currently probing, or they have probed, 2,500 drivers for misconduct. So the letter that they've submitted to Transport for London says the company has banned 451 capital licensed drivers as a result of the review, and 58 previously undisclosed criminal complaints from passengers have been passed to the police. I have absolutely no qualms whatsoever about nailing my colours completely to the mast of the black cab drivers, even though some of them constitute my most assiduous, say critics, to use a polite term, assiduous critics on issues like immigration and Brexit over on social media. But I don't choose my causes by the company I keep necessarily on this issue. So you have to point out that the people who complained to Uber could have gone to the police. So a lot of you have asked me, have sent me this story over the weekend. I think it was in the Sunday Times yesterday, and you said, how come that they didn't? How come the police aren't? Why are Uber investigating? Well, that's up to the complainant. That's not up to Uber. So that's why there are only 58 criminal complaints that have been passed on to the police. You need the passenger to agree to do it. The passenger might want to complain to Uber, but might not want to set the wheels of law in motion for a heap of potential reasons. But it's pretty grim, isn't it, to learn that that licence that was revoked back in September, they're now admitting to investigating 2,500 drivers for alleged misbehaviour. It was 6 alleged sex attacks and 3 other crimes by drivers that Uber were accused of failing to report. I don't know what will happen, guys, but I worry that, to be honest with you, if that is the only rationale TfL could have for doing it, they can't do it for it just being fundamentally unfair and a betrayal of the contract that taxi drivers entered into by this sort of finagling around the meaning of the word hail. That's what it all comes down to. For me, you press a button on your phone or you stick your hand in the air, you're hailing a taxi, but the courts disagreed. I guess if the reason that they saw the licence being removed was because they weren't investigating and properly reporting this stuff, if they can prove that they are investigating it and properly reporting this stuff, I think you might have a problem. I think the prospect of Uber slinging their hook is possibly diminishing. I don't know. We'll talk to Theo later. Back to buy-to-let. Charlie's in Chertsey. A delightful alliteration. Charlie, what would you like to say?
We became a buy-to-let landlord by default, really, because my partner and I had a property each. And when we got married, we thought we should keep the other one as like our pension. And
exactly. And you can easily see how people do that. It's not dissimilar to what happened to us when we just couldn't sell the house we were in time to buy the house we wanted to buy.
Yeah, but then some friends that had several properties that were letting them out below market rent, and one of them listens to you quite a bit as well and took conscious of what you were saying and thought, well, maybe I should sell them. So what he did, he sold them, but they were all snapped up. It was only 4 or 5 snapped up by one.
Only 4 or 5? Only 4 or 5? Come on.
Oh no, because he was thinking. No, it was either 4.
But if he was renting them out at below,
Can I finish, please? Because he was renting them out.
Because I don't believe you.
One
Sorry.
Tenant. No, it was slightly below.
Because if he was renting them out below market rate, then I wasn't talking to him, was I? I was talking to people who were having their homes bought for them by their tenants. So I don't think you're telling me the truth, Charlie and Chertsey.
But no, he was taking. He had them as buy-to-lets. They were out. When I say on the market rate, the estate agent was saying they should be rented. I think it was £1,200, and he was doing them at £1,000, £1,100 because of the people's situation.
Okay.
Now. And
he listened to my programme and thought I was urging him to stop helping people who couldn't afford to pay their rent.
Well,
Highly unlikely. Perhaps
sure.
you could get him some Otex eardrops.
Well, maybe you should be. People listen to people, but the downside of when he sold, whether it was
nose is growing,
or whatever he thought,
yes.
The new landlord put the prices of rent up.
Okay, thanks for calling, Charlie. I reserve the right not to believe you, but I completely accept that you might be telling the truth. Because very many people listen to this programme and then decide to stop trying to behave in an altruistic and generous fashion. I'm constantly banging the drum for selfishness and self-enrichment. Nell's in Eastleigh. Nell, what would you like to say?
Oh, hello. Hi.
Nell.
I'm one of these. I'm a tenant who's been. Yeah, we're one of the families who has quite high income, but is prevented by extremely high rents from getting anywhere near the housing
Do you know
market.
what you need to do? Do you know what you need to do?
What do I need to do?
Get your landlord to listen to this programme.
Oh, well.
And then he'll sell it, and you can buy it.
We've had 3 landlords in the past 2 years who've been made to move 3 times. The first time was revenge eviction. Second time, he just wanted to move back in. So we keep moving. I've got 3 children. It's impossible with schools. But really, the point I wanted to make about, that's sort of by the by. But recently, it's really interesting because what has happened is that the housing market has dried up, the buy-to-let market has dried up, so there's no properties to rent anymore because people are dumping their properties, basically. And so they're all for sale. So when we most recently went to try to find a property to let, and we wanted to find one that was within the school catchment areas of our kids' schools, because they're all at different schools, we actually got turned down on 2 or 3 properties. They said they didn't want to rent to people with children.
Oh, Lord.
I mean, they actually said that, I know. Exactly. And it's actually illegal in the US to do this. But
Is it not illegal here?
No.
I thought you could do it with pets. I didn't realise you could do it with children.
Yeah, you can. Too much wear and tear, we were told.
Yeah, no, of course.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you don't have to give me numbers, but the reason why you can't, you can afford to pay every month quite a significant sum of money, but you can't...
Over £1,000 a month rent, always.
And you can't scrape together a deposit because you're doing a Mr. McCorber and your costs of living are pretty much tallying with your income. Your outgoings and your incomings are pretty much equal.
Well, absolutely. I mean, our joint income is over 80,000, so it's not low. Okay, we're well above the average income in this country, and we still can't get anywhere near the housing market. But it's to do with the area. I mean,
people listening will now say, "Why don't you move?"
Well, that's exactly what I am doing. We're actually putting time for Brexit. We're leaving the country. I
didn't quite mean that. I just meant, moving to a cheaper part of this country.
Yeah, but it's also the jobs, isn't it? You can't get, my husband's job that he does, he's a software engineer. They don't have jobs outside the sort of London area, really. I mean,
Well, I'll take your word for that.
Yeah.
Because I'm now going to get bombarded by Mancunian software engineers. You realise that, don't you?
No,
Thanks for that, Nell.
No better, anyway.
Where are you going to move to? Do you know?
Oh, probably Ireland. The Republic of Ireland is the plan.
Yes.
Because it'll still be in the EU. So.
The irony, of course, is that the City AM reported recently that London house prices are already falling because of instability and uncertainty surrounding Brexit. So you go to Ireland, fill your boots, you can come back and buy up a whole street of houses, and you could be the Rackman of Eastleigh by the end of 2030.
Well, yeah. Maybe.
But don't forget to rent them out below the market value now, because that's what all landlords do, especially the ones that listen to me and then sell them as a result of the crisis of conscience that this has led them to. Oh, Charlie and Chertsey, honestly, you must have listened to this programme for long enough to know that the length of your nose was going to poke its way into the studio as it grew throughout your call. It's coming up to 11:59. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. That was lovely. Do you know what? Heathrow and buy-to-lets. We must have done them a million times, but I can't remember ending either of the conversations as sort of enlightened and educated as I have on both occasions this morning.